She pronounced the death curse in flawless Old Valthyrian, and every vampire in the interview chamber stopped breathing. The poor girl from the lower districts had just spoken words that hadn't been heard in the royal palace for 4 centuries, and the desperate king watching from behind the screen would move heaven and earth to keep her there. The marble chamber smelled of old money and older blood. Sarah's threadbare coat hung from her shoulders like an apology, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, patches visible even in the dim candlelight. She stood in the center of a circle of chairs, surrounded by 12 members of the Royal Education Council, their eyes cold as winter frost, their expressions ranging from boredom to barely concealed contempt. She'd known this was a mistake the moment she'd walked through the servants' entrance. The posting had appeared 3 weeks ago, nailed to the district message board where day laborers gathered at dawn. Position available, Royal Tutor for Prince Cassian. Must demonstrate exceptional knowledge of vampire history, customs, and classical studies. All qualified candidates may apply. That final line had been underlined twice, as if someone had fought to include it. All qualified candidates. Not all noble candidates. Not all wealthy candidates. All qualified. Sarah had memorized every book in the district's lending library by the time she was 12. She'd taught herself 6 languages by reading discarded newspapers and listening to merchant conversations in the marketplace. She'd stolen into university lectures, hiding in the back rows, absorbing knowledge like a plant starved for sunlight. Qualified didn't begin to cover what she was. But qualification meant nothing when you wore poverty like a second skin. Lord Armitage, the head counselor, adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles and studied the parchment before him with the enthusiasm of a man examining a dead rat. Sarah Blackwood, he read aloud, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. Age 23. No formal education. No teaching experience. No family connections. He looked up, his pale eyes scanning her from head to toe. Tell me, Miss Blackwood, what exactly makes you think you're qualified to educate the Crown Prince? The other council members tittered behind their hands. A woman in emerald silk whispered something to her neighbor, and they both laughed, not bothering to hide it. Sarah's fingernails dug into her palms. She'd prepared for this. Expected it, even. But preparation didn't stop the hot flush of shame from creeping up her neck. I can read and write in 7 languages, my lord, Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. I've studied vampire history extensively, including the Crimson Wars, the Treaty of Eternal Night, and the genealogies of the 12 founding houses. I've memorized the complete works of Valthyra the Wise, analyzed the philosophical treatises of the Shadow Scholars, and I can recite the legal codes established during the reign of King Aldrich the Just. 7 languages, Lord Armitage repeated, his tone mocking. How impressive. I assume these languages include the common tongue, market pidgin, and perhaps a bit of broken Elvish picked up from street peddlers? The chamber erupted in laughter. Even the guards stationed by the door smirked, their hands resting on their sword hilts. Sarah's face burned. This was why poor people didn't apply for royal positions. Not because they lacked ability, but because the system was designed to humiliate them into retreat. Actually, Sarah said quietly, I speak the common tongue, High Valthyrian, Low Valthyrian, Northern Elvish, Southern Elvish, and Dwarvish. The 7th is Old Valthyrian. The laughter died slightly. Old Valthyrian was a dead language used only by scholars and historians, the language of ancient texts and forgotten magic, the language that predated modern vampire society by centuries. A young man in blue velvet leaned forward, his expression skeptical. Prove it. Sarah took a breath. What would you like me to translate? The counselor smirked. Tell us what Prince Cassian's full title means in Old Valthyrian. Not the modern translation. The original meaning. The chamber went silent. Even Lord Armitage looked interested now, though his expression remained doubtful. Every educated vampire knew the prince's title in the common tongue, Cassian Morveth, Crown Prince of the Eternal Realm, first son of Moonlight, heir to the Throne of Shadows. But the old Valthyrian version was considered untranslatable, its nuances lost to time. Sarah closed her eyes, reaching for the words her grandmother had taught her during those long nights in their one-room apartment, when starvation made sleep impossible, and stories were the only warmth they could afford. When she spoke, her voice carried a different cadence, ancient and rhythmic, each syllable precise. Kasian Morvethanar, Korath Valan Chandriar Ethmara, Sharvel Nathir Ivarsha, Valmoth Tharek, Shavaran Dernoth. The effect was instantaneous. Every vampire in the chamber went rigid. One woman gasped. Lord Armitage's spectacles slipped down his nose. The young man in blue velvet had gone pale, his knuckles white where they gripped the arms of his chair. Because Sarah hadn't just translated the prince's title, she'd pronounced it correctly. Every inflection, every tonal shift, every subtle emphasis that changed meaning in a language where a single mispronounced vowel could turn a blessing into a curse. Old Valthyrian wasn't just dead. It was dangerous. It was the language of blood magic, of binding spells, of words that could compel obedience or unleash chaos, the language that vampire nobles had systematically erased from public knowledge centuries ago, precisely because it gave too much power to anyone who could wield it. And this poor girl from the lower districts had just spoken it with the fluency of a court scholar. More, demanded a woman with silver hair piled high in elaborate braids. Recite the oath of eternal service. That's not necessary, Lord Armitage began, but the silver-haired woman cut him off with a sharp gesture. If she truly knows old Valthyrian, she'll be able to recite it. The oath of eternal service was the pledge every royal tutor had to speak before accepting their position. In modern vampire society, it was ceremonial, translated into contemporary language, but the original oath, spoken in old Valthyrian, was considered so powerful that most scholars refused to utter it aloud. Sarah met the woman's eyes. She knew what this was. A test. A trap. If she recited the oath incorrectly, she'd be laughed out of the palace. If she refused, she'd prove herself a fraud. But if she succeeded, she'd be declaring herself bound by ancient magic that predated modern law, the kind of binding that couldn't be broken by any mortal means. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Words have power, child. Old words have older power. Speak them with respect, or don't speak them at all. Sarah spoke. The death curse she'd been asked to recite wasn't actually a death curse at all, despite its common translation. In Old Valthyrian, the words meant something far more nuanced. I bind my life to your service, my knowledge to your growth, my loyalty to your blood, until death or release. By moon and shadow, by blood and bone, so I swear. The oath rolled off her tongue like poetry, each word resonating in the marble chamber with weight that physical sound shouldn't possess. When she finished, the silence was absolute. No one laughed now. No one whispered. They stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked almost like fear. Because binding oaths spoken in Old Valthyrian weren't symbolic. They were real, enforceable by magic older than the royal family itself. And Sarah had just volunteered herself into service with words that couldn't be taken back. Behind the carved screen at the back of the chamber, King Theron Morveth watched the poor girl with growing fascination. He'd been attending council meetings incognito for years, hidden behind spelled wood that allowed him to observe without being seen. He'd sat through hundreds of tutor interviews, watching qualified candidates parade their credentials, their family connections, their carefully rehearsed knowledge. None of them had lasted more than 3 weeks with his son. Prince Cassian was brilliant, but he was also angry. Isolated. Struggling with a gift that no one in the palace understood because no one alive remembered the old ways. The boy needed someone who understood that the old magic still flowed through his veins, that his inability to speak anything but Old Valthyrian wasn't a curse, but a birthright. The king had been searching for 2 years, growing more desperate with each failed tutor, each report of his son's increasing isolation. And now this girl, this poor, educated beyond her station girl, had just demonstrated knowledge that could change everything. Lord Armitage cleared his throat, his composure fractured but recovering. That was, he began, and paused, searching for words. Unexpected, the silver-haired woman finished. Her expression had shifted from contempt to calculation. Where did you learn Old Valtherian, child? Sarah hesitated. The truth would raise more questions than it answered. My grandmother taught me. She was a scholar before circumstances changed, a diplomatic way of saying before your family lost everything and ended up in the lower districts, scraping by on day labor and charity. The counselors exchanged glances, silent conversations happening in raised eyebrows and slight nods. The king leaned forward behind his screen, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He'd already made his decision. The council could debate qualifications and propriety all they wanted, but he'd stopped listening to them months ago when they'd suggested sending Cassian away to a monastery for difficult children. His son wasn't difficult. His son was speaking a language no one else remembered, crying out in words that held the weight of centuries, and slowly drowning in isolation because no one could answer him. This girl could. That made her more qualified than every noble tutor in the kingdom. The interview continued for another hour. The tone shifted now from mockery to genuine assessment. They tested her knowledge of history, customs, protocol. She answered every question with quiet confidence, her poverty evident in her clothes, but invisible in her intellect. When they finally dismissed her, told her to wait in the antechamber for their decision, Sarah's legs nearly buckled with relief. The antechamber was a small room with stone benches and a single narrow window that looked out over the palace gardens. Sarah sank onto the cold stone and let her head fall into her hands. The binding oath still hummed in her blood, a subtle vibration that told her it had taken hold. She'd meant every word. If they gave her this position, she'd serve with everything she had. If they rejected her, well, the oath would fade, unfulfilled, and she'd return to the lending library where she worked for pennies, surrounded by books she'd already memorized. A door opened, not the one she'd entered through, but a smaller door she hadn't noticed, hidden in the paneling. King Theron stepped through, and Sarah shot to her feet so fast she felt dizzy. She'd seen the king before, of course. Everyone had seen him during public ceremonies, a tall figure in black armor, crowned and distant. Up close, he was more human than she'd expected, lines around his eyes, silver threading through his dark hair. Tired, like a man who carried weight that never got lighter. Your Majesty, Sarah breathed, dropping into a curtsy that was probably wrong because she'd learned courtly behavior from books, not practice. The king waved a hand dismissively. Sarah Blackwood, tell me about your grandmother. It wasn't a request. Sarah swallowed. She was a court scholar. Before I was born, she served King Aldrich's father, translating ancient texts, preserving old knowledge. When the purge happened, when the council decided Old Valtherian was too dangerous to teach, she refused to destroy her research. They stripped her of her position, her title, her home. We ended up in the lower districts. She taught me everything she knew before she died. The king studied her with eyes that had witnessed centuries. The purge was a mistake, one I've regretted since I took the throne. But there are those in power who fear the old ways, who believe knowledge should be controlled, rationed, kept in the hands of a chosen few. He moved to the window, looking out at gardens he probably barely saw anymore. My son speaks only in Old Valtherian. Sarah's breath caught. The rumors were true then. She'd heard whispers in the marketplace. Gossip passed between servants who served in the outer palace. The prince who didn't speak. The heir who spent all his time alone in his tower, refusing tutors, refusing company. Some said he was cursed. Others that he was simple-minded. A few brave souls suggested he was brilliant, but misunderstood. No one had mentioned Old Valtherian. That would require admitting the language still existed. Cassian is 8 years old, the king continued. He began speaking in the old tongue when he was 4. Complete sentences. Complex thoughts. The ancient magic recognized itself in him, chose him as a vessel. It's extraordinarily rare. The last recorded case was 600 years ago. His mother died when he was 5, and since then he's only retreated further into the old language. He won't speak anything else. Can't, I think, though I'm not certain. Every tutor I've hired has given up within weeks because they can't understand him. The loneliness is killing him. The king turned to face her. Can you speak with my son? Sarah's heart hammered. Yes, I can. Then the position is yours. Forget the council. They'll approve my decision because they have no choice. You'll begin tomorrow. He started toward the hidden door, then paused. Miss Blackwood, my son is not easy. He's angry at a world that can't hear him, frustrated by his own isolation. He may test you, reject you, try to drive you away like he's driven away all the others. Sarah lifted her chin. I understand anger, Your Majesty. I understand isolation. The lower districts teach you what it's like to be invisible in a world that won't see you. The king's expression softened. Yes, I believe they do. That evening, Sarah stood in the room she'd been assigned and tried not to cry. It was small, a servant's chamber in the tower adjacent to the prince's apartments, but it had a real bed with clean sheets, a desk, a window with glass that actually sealed properly against the cold. Luxury beyond anything she'd known since her grandmother died. On the desk, someone had left a stack of books. Vampire history, royal genealogies, protocol manuals, and beneath them all, wrapped in oiled cloth, something that made Sarah's hands shake when she unwrapped it. Her grandmother's journal. The one that had been confiscated during the purge, that Sarah had assumed was burned or lost forever. Someone had kept it, preserved it. And now it was being returned to her. She opened the leather cover, saw her grandmother's familiar handwriting, and couldn't stop the tears anymore. The first entry was dated 40 years ago. Today they told me old Valtherian is too dangerous to teach, that the old magic must be forgotten. They are fools. You cannot kill a language by decree. It lives in blood and bone, in the spaces between words, in children who are born remembering what their ancestors knew. If I am the last scholar, then I will teach my granddaughter, and she will teach the next generation, and the words will survive despite their fear. Sarah pressed the journal to her chest and made a silent promise to the grandmother she'd lost. I won't fail. I'll teach your words to a prince who needs them. I'll prove knowledge is not dangerous. Ignorance is. The next morning, Sarah climbed the spiral staircase to Prince Cassian's tower with her grandmother's journal tucked under her arm and her heart in her throat. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of feet, the walls lined with portraits of dead kings whose eyes seemed to follow her ascent. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night reviewing vocabulary and grammatical structures, preparing lessons in her mind. 2 guards stood outside the prince's door, their expressions carefully neutral. The king said you were coming, one of them said. Good luck, you'll need it. He knocked twice, waited, then pushed the door open. The prince's apartments were not what Sarah expected. She'd imagined luxury, excess, the kind of opulence that defined royalty. Instead, she found a space that looked more like a scholar's study than a child's room. Books everywhere, stacked on tables, piled on the floor, overflowing from shelves that lined every wall. Maps covered one entire section, ancient territories marked in faded ink. A massive desk sat by the window, its surface buried under papers covered in cramped handwriting. And in the center of it all, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by open volumes, was a small boy with dark hair that fell into eyes too old for his face. Prince Cassian didn't look up when she entered. He kept his attention fixed on the book in his lap, his finger tracing lines of text with intense concentration. Sarah recognized the volume. An original copy of the Chronicle of Shadows, written in Old Valtherian, detailing the first vampire king's rise to power. It was rare enough that most scholars only saw reproductions. This child was reading the actual manuscript. She closed the door softly behind her. Hello, she said in Old Valtherian, the words feeling like coming home. My name is Sarah. I'm your new tutor. The prince's head snapped up. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp and assessing. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, taking in her worn dress, her unbound hair, the fact that she was clearly not nobility. Then he spoke, his voice clear and strong despite his small size. You'll leave like the others. They always leave. His Old Valtherian was perfect. Not just grammatically correct, but nuanced, inflected with emotional depth that most adult speakers never achieved. Sarah moved closer, carefully avoiding the stacks of books. I won't leave. The prince's laugh was bitter, wrong coming from someone so young. That's what they all say. Then they realize I'm not worth the trouble. I can't talk like normal people. I can't be what everyone wants me to be. So they leave, and father looks more disappointed, and everyone whispers about the broken prince, who will never be fit to rule. Sarah's heart cracked. She recognized that tone, the defensive anger, the preemptive rejection. She'd used it herself, back when she'd first tried to attend public lectures, when noble students had mocked her district accent and questioned her right to be there. You're not broken. You're speaking the language of power, of magic, of kings, who built this realm from nothing. That's not a curse. It's a gift that no one else has learned to appreciate. Cassian's expression flickered. Uncertainty beneath the hostility. You're just saying that. The king probably told you what to say. Sarah sat down on the floor across from him, ignoring protocol entirely. Your father didn't tell me what to say. He told me you need someone who can speak with you, understand you, hear the things you're trying to express. That's why I'm here, not because I was ordered, but because I know what it's like to have words trapped inside you that no one else can understand. The prince's fingers tightened on his book. You're from the lower districts. I can tell by your clothes. Why would someone like you understand anything about being a prince? Because, Sarah said quietly, loneliness doesn't care about class. Pain doesn't check your bank account before it visits. And isolation is isolation whether you experience it in a tower full of books or a one-room apartment with holes in the roof. Cassian's eyes glistened. He blinked rapidly, turning his attention back to his book. What if I test you? Ask you questions you can't answer? Prove you're like all the others who claim to know Old Valtherian but actually just memorized a few phrases? Then you'll prove I'm not qualified. And you'll be right to reject me, Sarah said. But if I can answer, will you give me a chance? Not just one lesson. A real chance. The prince considered this, his small hands drummed against the book's cover. A nervous gesture that reminded Sarah of herself at his age, always fidgeting, unable to sit still when her mind raced faster than her body could follow. Finally, he nodded. Fine. One chance. He stood abruptly, moving to the desk. He shuffled through papers until he found what he was looking for. A single sheet covered in Old Valtherian script. He thrust it toward her. Translate this. But not just the words. Tell me what it means. The meaning beneath the meaning. Sarah took the paper carefully. The text was a poem, or perhaps a prayer. The Old Valtherian was formal, ceremonial, the kind used in sacred contexts. She read it through once. Then again, letting the words settle in her mind, feeling for their deeper resonance. This is from the rite of recognition, she said slowly. It's what vampire lords used to speak when acknowledging a child's coming of age. But it's also a lament. The speaker is mourning the loss of childhood innocence while celebrating the strength that comes from pain. The repeated phrase, Shavarin Dernoth, doesn't just mean heir to shadows. It means known who walks in darkness, but carries light within. It's about bearing burdens that others can't see, about being strong even when you feel like breaking. She looked up and found Cassian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I wrote that. Last month, when Father told me the council wanted to send me away. Sarah's throat tightened. It's beautiful. Sad, but beautiful. And very wise for someone so young. I'm not wise, Cassian said, his voice small suddenly. I'm just alone. Not anymore, Sarah replied. The prince's facade cracked. His lower lip trembled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like what he was. An 8-year-old child who'd lost his mother, who couldn't communicate with anyone except one other person in the entire kingdom, who carried the weight of an entire realm's expectations on shoulders, barely strong enough to hold them. Can you really speak, old Valtherian? He asked, and there was such hope in the question that Sarah had to blink away her own tears. Not just words. Can you really speak it the way I do? The way it's supposed to be spoken? Yes, Sarah said firmly. I can. My grandmother taught me. She was a court scholar before the purge. She knew the old ways, the proper pronunciations, the contextual meanings. She taught me that Old Valtherian isn't just a language. It's a way of thinking, of understanding the world. Every verb carries emotional weight. Every noun has historical resonance. It's poetry and magic and history all woven together. Teach me, Cassian whispered. Please. Everyone else tries to make me learn their language, speak their words, fit into their understanding. But you know mine. Teach me more. Help me understand why I'm like this. Why the old magic chose me. I will, Sarah promised. We'll study together. Not just vocabulary and grammar, but context and history. I'll show you every text my grandmother preserved, every piece of knowledge the purge tried to destroy. You'll learn why you're special, why your gift matters, why the old ways need to survive. The first week passed in a blur of lessons and revelations. Cassian was brilliant, his mind sharp as cut glass, hungry for knowledge in a way that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. But he was also wounded, carrying scars that ran deeper than physical injury. Every time someone knocked on the door, he flinched. Every unexpected sound made him tense. He'd learned to expect rejection, and it showed in every defensive gesture, every guarded expression. Sarah adapted her teaching style to his needs. When he grew restless, they walked through the gardens discussing philosophy while examining flowers. When he became overwhelmed, she read to him from ancient texts, letting the rhythm of Old Valtherian soothe him like a lullaby. When he tested her patience with impossible questions and deliberate provocation, she met his challenges with calm competence, proving again and again that she wouldn't abandon him. The breakthrough came during their 5th lesson, when Cassian finally asked the question he'd been circling around since they met. Why did the old magic choose me? What does it want? Sarah set down the text they'd been studying. The old magic doesn't want anything. It is. It exists in the spaces between what is and what could be. It chose you because you have the capacity to hold it, to channel it, to speak its truths. But that doesn't mean you're obligated to use it the way others expect. Your gift is yours. How you wield it is your choice. But everyone expects me to be like the old kings, Cassian said, frustration bleeding into his words. They want me to use Old Valtherian for binding spells and blood magic and controlling people. That's what the language was used for, wasn't it? That's why they tried to erase it. Sarah chose her words carefully. Old Valtherian was used for many things. Yes, blood magic and binding spells, but also for poetry that could make the stars weep. For healing rites that knit broken bones and mended shattered spirits. For treaties that held peace for centuries because the words themselves carried weight. The language has power because words shape reality. But power is not inherently good or evil. It's what you choose to do with it that matters. Cassian pulled his knees to his chest, making himself smaller. I don't want to hurt people. I don't want to be the kind of king who uses words as weapons. Then don't be, Sarah said simply. Be the kind of king who uses words as bridges, who speaks truth that others need to hear. who remembers what everyone else has forgotten and uses that knowledge to build something better. The prince looked at her with those two old eyes. Is that what your grandmother tried to do? Yes. And they punished her for it. Because powerful people fear knowledge they can't control. But that doesn't mean the work wasn't worth doing. She saved the old ways so that someone like you could learn them, could understand your own gift, could choose what kind of legacy to create. A knock at the door interrupted them. The king entered, and Cassian immediately straightened, his defensive walls slamming back into place. "Father," he said in Old Valtherian, the formal tone he always used with his father, distant and respectful and utterly impersonal. The king's expression tightened. He understood enough Old Valtherian to recognize when his son was shutting him out. "How are the lessons progressing?" the king asked in the common tongue, looking to Sarah for translation. "Cassian speaks excellent Old Valtherian," Sarah said, deliberately not translating. "We've been studying the Chronicle of Shadows and discussing the philosophical implications of blood magic versus healing magic in ancient vampire society." The king's jaw clenched. "Miss Blackwood, I would appreciate if you would translate for my son. I wish to speak with him." Sarah hesitated, caught between two impossible positions. She could feel Cassian's tension radiating across the room, could see the pain in the king's eyes. "With respect, Your Majesty, perhaps you could speak to the prince directly." In Old Valtherian. "I could help with pronunciation if needed." The king's expression hardened. "I'm not here to take language lessons. I'm here to see my son." "Your Majesty," Sarah said quietly, "this is about more than language. When you ask me to translate, you're putting a barrier between yourself and Prince Cassian. You're telling him that meeting him in his world isn't worth the effort, that he needs to change, to adapt, to become something more comfortable for you." The silence that followed was dangerous. The king's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Sarah thought she'd gone too far, that she'd be dismissed despite her oath, despite Cassian's progress. Then King Theron's shoulders sagged. "You're right. God help me, you're right." He turned to his son. "Cassian, he paused, struggling. The common tongue felt inadequate suddenly. "How did you tell your child you'd failed him? How did you apologize for years of distance, of misunderstanding, of letting fear and frustration build walls between you? Teach me," the king said finally, the words rough. "Please, both of you. Teach me to speak with my son." The transformation in Cassian's expression was instantaneous. Shock. Disbelief. Hope so fragile it looked like it might shatter at the slightest touch. "You want to learn? Old Valtherian, but you said it was dangerous. That I needed to learn to speak properly, to use the common tongue like normal people." The king knelt, bringing himself to his son's eye level. "I was wrong. I was frightened. Your mother died, and you changed. And I didn't know how to reach you. I thought if I could make you speak my language, I could understand you. But I was asking you to give up part of yourself. I see that now." Sarah watched father and son stare at each other across a chasm of misunderstanding that was finally beginning to close. Cassian's hands trembled. "It's hard. Old Valtherian isn't like other languages. The grammar is complex. The pronunciation is difficult. You have to feel the words, not just speak them. I don't care if it's hard," the king said. "You're my son. You're worth the effort." Something broke in Cassian then. He launched himself forward, throwing his arms around his father's neck, and the king caught him, holding him tight the way he probably hadn't since the boy was small enough to carry. Sarah turned away, giving them privacy, her own eyes burning. She understood what was happening here. It wasn't just about language, it was about a father finally choosing to enter his son's world, instead of demanding his son enter his. It was about recognizing that love sometimes means learning new ways to communicate, new ways to connect, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable, and requires admitting you were wrong. When Cassian finally pulled back, his face was streaked with tears, but he was smiling. "Can we start now?" he asked. "I want to teach you. I want to share this with you." The king's decision to learn Old Valthyrian did not go unnoticed. Within days, the entire palace buzzed with gossip. Servants whispered in corridors. Nobles debated in private parlors. The Education Council, feeling undermined, called emergency meetings to discuss the propriety of a king learning a supposedly dead language. Lord Armitage led the opposition with barely concealed contempt. "Your Majesty," he addressed the king during a tense council session that Sarah attended as official tutor, "Old Valthyrian was banned for good reason. It is the language of blood magic, of dangerous binding spells, of powers that modern vampire society has evolved beyond. To resurrect it now, especially with the Crown Prince speaking it exclusively, sends a message that we are regressing, returning to barbaric practices that our ancestors wisely abandoned." The king's expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the muscle ticking in his jaw. "The language was never banned, Lord Armitage. The teaching of it was discouraged. There is a difference, and my son was not consulted about which language his magic would choose to express itself through. Should I punish him for circumstances beyond his control?" But the council member in emerald silk leaned forward, her voice honeyed with false concern. "No one suggests punishing the prince, Your Majesty, but perhaps, with proper guidance, with the right therapeutic interventions, he could learn to channel his magic through more acceptable forms of expression." The king's eyes went cold. "You mean suppress his natural abilities? Teach him to hate what he is? Make him ashamed of his gift? That is not guidance, Lady Viridian. That is cruelty dressed in concern." Sarah watched the power dynamics play out with growing understanding. These nobles didn't fear Old Valthyrian because it was dangerous. They feared it because it represented knowledge they couldn't control. As long as the language remained lost, they could claim authority over what history meant, what the old ways represented, what power looked like. But a prince who spoke Old Valthyrian fluently, who could access ancient texts directly rather than through their approved translations, who might one day challenge their carefully constructed narratives, that terrified them. "If I may speak, Your Majesty," Sarah said quietly. The king gestured for her to continue. "I have been teaching Prince Cassian for 2 weeks now. In that time, he has made remarkable progress, not just in understanding the historical and linguistic context of Old Valthyrian, but in emotional regulation, in confidence, in his willingness to engage with the world beyond his tower. He smiles now. He laughs. He asks questions with curiosity rather than defensiveness. The language is not harming him. The isolation, the rejection, the constant message that he is broken, those are what harm him." Lord Armitage's lip curled. "You are a tutor, Miss Blackwood, not a physician, not a counselor, and certainly not someone qualified to determine what is best for the Crown Prince." "With respect, my lord," Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I am someone who speaks Prince Cassian's language. That makes me more qualified to assess his well-being than anyone in this chamber who refuses to learn it." The room erupted. Half the council members shouted objections. The other half looked uncomfortable, uncertain. The king raised his hand for silence. "Enough. Miss Blackwood serves at my pleasure, and I have seen evidence of my son's improvement with my own eyes. The matter is settled. Old Valthyrian will be studied in the palace. I will learn it. Those who wish to effectively serve the Crown Prince will learn it. Those who refuse," he paused significantly, "may wish to consider whether their positions remain relevant." It was a threat delivered with royal calm. The council members subsided, but Sarah could see the resentment simmering beneath their forced compliance. She'd made enemies today, powerful ones who would not forget the lower district girl who dared to speak against them. After the meeting, the king walked with Sarah back toward the prince's tower. "That was dangerous," he said quietly, contradicting the council publicly. "They will not forgive that easily." "I know," Sarah replied. "But someone needed to say it. They were talking about Cassian like he was a problem to be solved rather than a child to be understood." The king glanced at her, his expression unreadable. You care about him." "Yes," Sarah said simply. "He's brilliant and lonely and desperate to be seen." "How could I not care?" Theron stopped walking. "You remind me of his mother. Elara didn't care about politics or protocol either. She said what needed to be said, consequences be damned. It drove the council insane, but it made her a good queen. And a good mother." Sarah's throat tightened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Your Majesty." The king resumed walking. Cassian was 4 when she died, barely old enough to understand what death meant. He stopped speaking in the common tongue within weeks. The physician said it was trauma. "But I think," he paused, struggling for words, "I think he retreated into Old Valtherian because it was the language his mother used to sing him lullabies. She knew the old ways. She was the one who first recognized what he was, what he would become. When she died, he lost the only person who truly understood him. Until you." Sarah felt the weight of that statement. "I'm not trying to replace his mother. I couldn't." "No," the king agreed. "But you're giving him something she would have wanted him to have. Connection. Understanding. The knowledge that his gift is not a curse." They reached the tower stairs. The king hesitated, his hand on the railing. "Teach me faster," he said abruptly. "I need to be able to communicate with my son properly, not just simple phrases. Real conversation. I've lost too much time already." "I can increase our lessons," Sarah said. "But Your Majesty, language is not just vocabulary and grammar. It's practice. It's making mistakes and trying again. You need to speak with Cassian, even when you're uncertain, even when you get things wrong. He'll help you. He wants to help you. But what if I fail? What if I can't learn fast enough? What if he gives up on me the way the king's voice cracked, the way I almost gave up on him? Then you try again," Sarah said gently. "That's what love is. Continuing to try even when it's difficult. Even when you fail. Even when it would be easier to give up. You show up. You keep learning. You prove that he matters more than your pride, your comfort, your fear." The king nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning. We'll start earlier. I want daily lessons. Whatever it takes." He climbed the stairs without waiting for a response, determination in every step. Sarah watched him go, then made her way to the library. She needed to prepare more advanced lesson plans, needed to find ways to accelerate the king's learning without overwhelming him. The ancient section of the palace library was her favorite place, all dark wood and dusty silence, filled with texts so old their pages crumbled at the slightest touch. She was deep in a comparative grammar text when she heard footsteps behind her. "You're making trouble, girl." Sarah turned to find Lord Armitage standing between the towering shelves, his expression cold. "I'm teaching, my lord. That is my job." "You're undermining centuries of careful social structure," he countered. "Do you have any idea what will happen if Old Valtherian becomes widely spoken again? If anyone, even those from the lower districts, can access the magic bound in those words, the balance of power would shift. Those who have carefully maintained order would lose their authority. Chaos would follow. Or, Sarah said evenly, knowledge would become democratized. Power would be distributed more fairly. Those who have been silenced would finally have a voice." "That's not chaos, Lord Armitage. That's justice." The nobleman's face twisted. "You stupid child. You have no understanding of politics, of power, of the delicate equilibrium that keeps this kingdom functioning. If I allow you to continue, everything we've built will crumble." "Allow me?" Sarah stood, drawing herself to her full height. "You don't allow anything. The king does. And he has made his decision clear. Unless you're planning to commit treason by defying royal decree." Lord Armitage stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Accidents happen in palaces, Miss Blackwood. Tutors fall from tower windows. Food becomes mysteriously poisoned. Young women disappear, and no one asks questions because they're from districts that don't matter. Remember that you are replaceable. The prince may prefer you now, but grief is survivable. He'll move on. You, however, will not. Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. If anything happens to me, the king will know exactly who to suspect. And if you think he values your counsel more than his son's happiness, you're deluding yourself. The nobleman's eyes flashed dangerously. We'll see. He turned and vanished between the shelves, leaving Sarah alone with her racing pulse and the sudden certainty that her enemies were more dangerous than she'd realized. She gathered her books with shaking hands and hurried back to her chamber. Once inside with the door locked, she allowed herself to tremble, to acknowledge her fear. She was one poor girl in a palace full of people who saw her as a threat. She had no family, no connections, no protection beyond the king's goodwill. And that goodwill was contingent on her continued usefulness. But Cassian needed her. And she'd made a binding oath that couldn't be broken. So she would continue, carefully, watching her back, but continuing. The lessons with King Theron proceeded with surprising intensity. Every morning before dawn, the king arrived at Cassian's tower, ready to learn. He struggled with the complex grammar, stumbled over pronunciations, grew frustrated with his own limitations. But he never missed a session, never gave up. Cassian watched his father's efforts with wonder that gradually transformed into something deeper. Pride. Connection. The slow understanding that his father was trying, really trying, to reach him. One morning, 3 weeks into the lessons, Cassian corrected his father's pronunciation of a particularly difficult phrase. The king had been attempting to say, "I am proud of you," but kept placing the emphasis wrong, which actually changed the meaning to "I am surprised by you." "Not there," Cassian signed, his hands gentle. The stress falls on the second syllable. Like this. He repeated the phrase correctly. The king tried again. "Better," Cassian encouraged, "but the vowel is longer, more like singing than speaking. Old Valtherian has music in it. You have to feel the rhythm." Theron closed his eyes, trying to internalize the correction. When he spoke again, the phrase still wasn't perfect, but it was closer, much closer. Cassian's face transformed with delight. "That was good. You're getting better, father. Really better." The king's eyes went suspiciously bright. "Thank you," he managed in Old Valtherian, the simple phrase heavy with meaning. "For teaching me. For being patient with your foolish father." "You're not foolish," Cassian replied, his voice soft. "You're learning." "That's brave." Sarah watched them from her position by the window, her heart full. This was what healing looked like. Not dramatic declarations or grand gestures, but small moments of connection, patient repetition, the willingness to be vulnerable and make mistakes. The transformation in their relationship was visible. Where before the king and prince had maintained careful distance, now they sat close together during lessons, shoulders touching. Where before they'd communicated through formal politeness, now they shared jokes in halting Old Valtherian, laughing at mispronunciations and grammatical errors. Where before Cassian had flinched from his father's touch, now he leaned into it, seeking comfort and connection. After that morning's lesson, the king lingered. "Miss Blackwood, I want to plan something. A public event where Cassian can demonstrate his knowledge. Show the court that his gift is not a curse but an asset to the kingdom." Sarah's stomach tightened with concern. "Your Majesty, with respect, that could be risky. There are those in the court who would use any opportunity to undermine him, to prove that Old Valtherian is dangerous or inappropriate." "I know," the king said, "but my son cannot hide in this tower forever. He is the crown prince. Eventually he will need to face the court, to claim his position. Better to do it on our terms, with preparation, than to wait until circumstances force his hand." Cassian signed urgently. "What are you planning?" "A demonstration," his father replied in careful Old Valtherian. "You would speak publicly, Show them what you can do." The prince's eyes went wide. "Speak in front of the court? They hate me. They think I'm broken. They're wrong," the king said firmly. "And I want to prove it. But only if you're willing. Only if you feel ready. I'll be there. Miss Blackwood will be there. We won't let them hurt you." Cassian looked to Sarah, uncertainty written across his young face. "Do you think I should?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "I think you have knowledge and abilities that are extraordinary. Whether you share them publicly is your choice. But if you decide to do this, we'll prepare thoroughly. We'll make sure you feel confident. And we'll show them that old Valtherian is beautiful, powerful, and worthy of respect." The prince was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll do it. But I want to choose what to demonstrate. And I want to explain why old Valtherian matters. Not just show off like a trained animal performing tricks." "Agreed," the king said. "This is your event. Your voice." Over the next 2 weeks they prepared. Cassian chose a section from the Chronicle of Shadows, a passage about the first vampire king's vision, for a realm built on knowledge rather than conquest. He practiced his delivery until it flowed like poetry, every inflection perfect. Sarah taught him how to project his voice, how to make eye contact with an audience, how to handle hostile questions with grace. The king invited the entire court to what he called an educational demonstration, to take place in the Grand Hall. Attendance was not optional. The night before the event, Sarah found Cassian on the tower balcony, staring out at the palace gardens below. She joined him in silence, letting him gather his thoughts. "What if I fail?" he asked finally. "What if I freeze, or forget the words, or prove everyone right who says I'm broken?" "Then you'll try again," Sarah said. "But Cassian, you won't fail. I've watched you master this material. I've seen your dedication, your intelligence, your passion for the old ways. You are ready. But what if they don't understand? What if I speak perfectly and they still refuse to see the value?" "Then you'll have planted a seed," Sarah replied. "Change doesn't happen in an instant. It happens gradually, through persistent demonstration of truth. Tomorrow you'll show them something they've never seen. Some will reject it, but others will be curious. And curiosity is the beginning of understanding." Cassian leaned against the balcony railing. "My mother would have known what to do. She always knew how to handle the court, how to make them listen even when they didn't want to." "Tell me about her," Sarah encouraged. The prince was quiet for a moment, then began speaking in Old Valtherian, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "She was fearless. Not reckless, but genuinely unafraid of what people thought. She used to sing me lullabies in Old Valtherian, before anyone realized that was my language. She said words were magic, that the right words spoken with the right intention could change the world. When she died, it felt like the magic died too. Like I was the only one left who remembered the songs." "You're not alone anymore," Sarah said gently. "Your father is learning. I'm here, and tomorrow you'll share your magic with people who need to remember what they've forgotten." The prince nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Promise you'll be there? Right where I can see you?" "I promise." The next morning, the grand hall filled with nobles in elaborate finery, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled hostility. Lord Armitage and his faction clustered together, whispering behind gloved hands. Lady Viridian wore a smile sharp enough to draw blood. The king took his position on the throne, Cassian standing beside him in formal robes that made him look even smaller and more vulnerable. Sarah positioned herself near the front, close enough that the prince could make eye contact when needed. The king stood, and the hall fell silent. "My son, Prince Cassian, will demonstrate his mastery of Old Valtherian today. This language, which some of you believe should remain forgotten, is in fact a vital part of our history, our magic, our heritage. The Crown Prince is not chosen to speak only in Old Valtherian. The old magic has chosen him as its vessel, its voice, its keeper. Today you will witness why that choice was not a curse but a profound gift to our realm. Cassian stepped forward. He looked so small in the center of that vast space, surrounded by hundreds of eyes, most of them skeptical or hostile. Sarah saw his hands tremble, saw him take a deep breath. Then, he began to speak. The Old Valtherian rolled from his lips like song, like poetry, like thunder contained in a child's voice. He recited the passage from the Chronicle of Shadows, his pronunciation flawless, his delivery passionate. The words spoke of a king who valued wisdom over conquest, who built libraries instead of dungeons, who believed that true power came from knowledge freely shared rather than hoarded. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The air in the grand hall began to shimmer. The ancient words, spoken with such precision and passion, triggered the latent magic woven into the palace's foundation. Centuries-old spells, placed there by builders who'd used Old Valtherian as their working language, recognized the voice calling to them, and responded. Golden light bloomed around Cassian, soft at first, then growing brighter, casting intricate shadows that formed patterns on the walls, ancient symbols that most of the court had never seen but somehow understood on an instinctive level. The magic wasn't dangerous. It was beautiful, protective. It wrapped around the prince like a shield, like a blessing, like proof that he was exactly what he was meant to be. The nobles gasped. Some stepped back in fear. Others leaned forward in wonder. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized what was happening. The palace itself was accepting Cassian, acknowledging him as the true heir, the one who could speak its original language and therefore command its ancient protections. The prince continued his recitation, seemingly unaware of the magical display surrounding him, completely focused on delivering the passage with perfect accuracy. When he finished, the light faded gradually, reluctantly, as if the palace magic was disappointed to fall silent again. Cassian stood in the sudden normalcy, his chest heaving, his eyes bright with unshed tears. He'd done it. The hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment. Then King Theron rose from his throne and descended to stand beside his son. He placed both hands on Cassian's shoulders and spoke in Old Valtherian, his pronunciation still imperfect but his meaning unmistakable. I am proud of you. So proud. You have shown them what I always knew, that you are extraordinary. The king's public use of Old Valtherian sent shockwaves through the crowd. If the king himself was learning the supposedly dangerous language, if he was endorsing it, if he was using it to communicate with his heir, then the council's arguments about its impropriety lost significant weight. Applause started slowly. A few brave nobles, perhaps those who remembered the old ways, or who simply recognized brilliance when they saw it, began to clap. The sound spread, growing louder, more enthusiastic. Not everyone joined in. Lord Armitage stood rigid, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. But enough people applauded that it became clear the demonstration had achieved its goal. Cassian looked to Sarah, his expression seeking confirmation. She nodded, smiling through her own tears. You were magnificent, she signed, knowing he could see her across the crowd. The prince's answering smile was brighter than the magic that had surrounded him moments before. The reception following the demonstration was awkward but revealing. Some nobles approached Cassian tentatively, asking questions about Old Valtherian, expressing interest in learning. Others maintained their distance, making their disapproval clear through silence and cold glances. The prince handled both reactions with grace that belied his age, patient with the curious, unbothered by the hostile. One elderly vampire, Lord Ashford, a council member who rarely spoke in meetings, approached with tears on his weathered face. My grandmother spoke Old Valtherian, he said to Sarah, his voice cracking. She died when I was young, and I thought I'd never hear it again. The way the prince speaks, it sounds exactly like her voice. He has given me back a piece of my childhood I thought I'd lost forever. Thank you for teaching him. Thank you for preserving what we almost destroyed. Sarah felt the weight of that gratitude, the reminder that language was not just communication, but memory, identity, connection to the past. This was why her grandmother had fought so hard to preserve the old ways. Not because Old Valtherian was inherently superior, but because losing any language meant losing a way of understanding the world, losing access to thoughts and feelings that couldn't be fully translated. As the reception wound down, Lord Armitage finally approached. His expression was carefully controlled, but Sarah could see the rage simmering beneath. "That was quite a performance," he said, his tone conversational but his eyes cold. "Though I wonder how much was the boy's actual ability, and how much was theatrical magic designed to impress the easily swayed." "The prince's ability is genuine," Sarah replied evenly. The magic responded to his words because he spoke them correctly, with proper understanding and intention. "That's not theater. That's mastery." And mastery, Lord Armitage said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear, "is precisely what concerns me. A child with that much power, speaking a language that can compel and bind, guided by a tutor with no family connections, and therefore no invested interest in maintaining the existing social order. Do you truly not see how dangerous this is? Or do you see it and simply not care because you're too naive to understand the consequences?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "What I see, my lord, is a brilliant child who was isolated and suffering until someone bothered to learn his language. What I see is a father and son reconnecting after years of painful distance. What I see is knowledge being shared rather than hoarded. If that threatens the existing social order, perhaps the order itself is the problem, not the solution." The nobleman's expression went ice cold. "You've made your position clear, Miss Blackwood. I trust you'll forgive me for remembering this conversation when consequences inevitably arrive." He walked away, leaving Sarah with the uncomfortable certainty that she'd made things worse. But she couldn't regret her words. Someone needed to name what was really happening here. To acknowledge that the resistance to Old Valtherian wasn't about safety or propriety. It was about power. About who got to control knowledge. About maintaining hierarchies that benefited a few at the expense of many. That night, Sarah was returning to her chamber when she found the door ajar. She froze, her pulse spiking. She'd locked it that morning. She always locked it. Carefully, she pushed the door open wider, searching the shadows for threat. Her room had been ransacked. Books torn from shelves, papers scattered across the floor, her mattress slashed, clothes pulled from the wardrobe and shredded, but worst of all, her grandmother's journal, the precious artifact she'd kept hidden beneath a floorboard, lay in the center of the destruction, pages ripped out and scattered, ink bleeding where water had been poured over the leather binding. Sarah's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, gathering the torn pages with shaking hands, trying to piece together what could be salvaged. The message was clear. This was not random destruction. This was calculated intimidation. A demonstration of how easily her most precious possession could be violated. She didn't know how long she sat there, clutching fragments of her grandmother's handwriting, before she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Blackwood?" Sarah turned to find the king standing in her doorway, taking in the destruction with a grim expression. The guards reported unusual activity in this corridor. He entered, his eyes sweeping across the devastation. "Who did this?" "I don't know," Sarah lied, because she couldn't prove it was Lord Armitage, and accusations without evidence would only make things worse. The king knelt beside her, his hand hovering over the destroyed journal. "This is your grandmother's work." "Yes." Sarah's voice cracked. "It was all I had left of her. All her research, her translations, her notes on the old ways. And now it's ruined." "Not ruined," the king said quietly. "Damaged, yes, but not destroyed completely. We have archivists who specialize in document restoration. We have mages who can recover ink from water-damaged pages. If you allow me, I will have them work on this. They will restore what can be saved." Sarah looked at him. This vampire king who'd spent weeks learning a difficult language just to connect with his son, who'd defended her in council meetings, who was now offering to help repair the physical manifestation of her grief. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care about a destroyed book? Why does any of this matter to you?" "Because," the king said, his expression softening, "my wife died holding a book in Old Valtherian. She was reading it to Cassian when she collapsed. The physician said it was a heart defect, something that had always been there, waiting. But I've always wondered if she knew, if she was trying to pass on as much as she could before time ran out. When you speak about your grandmother, when I see the love you have for the knowledge she gave you, it reminds me of Alara, of what she tried to preserve, of why it matters." Sarah felt tears slip down her cheeks. "I'm not brave like her. I'm just trying to survive, and I'm not doing a very good job of it." "You're braver than you think," the king replied. "You stood in front of the council and defended my son when it would have been safer to stay silent. You corrected me when I was wrong, risked my anger to speak truth. You faced threats and intimidation and continue teaching. That is not weakness. That is extraordinary courage." The king insisted Sarah move to a more secure chamber, one in the royal family's wing with guards posted at all hours. She resisted at first, uncomfortable with the preferential treatment, aware of how it would feed court gossip. But the alternative was staying in a room where she no longer felt safe, where every shadow might hide another threat. She moved her few belongings, what remained of them, to the new quarters. The king also assigned her a personal guard, a serious young vampire named Marcus, who took his duty with grave intensity. "You don't need to follow me everywhere," Sarah protested after the third day of having Marcus shadow her every movement. "With respect, Miss Blackwood, the king disagrees. And frankly, so do I. Someone ransacked your chamber. Someone is sending messages. Until we identify who, I'm not leaving your side." Cassian found the entire situation simultaneously concerning and amusing. "You have a bodyguard now? Like a noble?" He signed during their morning lesson, his hands moving with exaggerated importance. "Does this mean you're officially important?" "I was always important," Sarah signed back, deliberately haughty. "I just have better documentation now." The prince laughed, the sound still surprising every time she heard it, still such a contrast to the silent, withdrawn child she'd first met. Their lessons continued, expanding beyond language to include vampire history, political philosophy, practical magic theory. Cassian absorbed everything with voracious curiosity, asking questions that often stumped Sarah and sent her back to the library for research. One afternoon, while discussing the ethics of binding spells, Cassian paused mid-sentence. "Miss Sarah, if you could ask my mother one question, what would it be?" Sarah set down the text they'd been studying. "That's a heavy question. Why do you ask?" "Because you lost someone important too," the prince replied. "Your grandmother. And sometimes I think you understand what it's like to miss someone in a way others don't. Father misses mother. I know he does. But he didn't lose the only person who could speak his language. He can talk to anyone. I can only talk to you and him. And he's still learning. Sometimes I wonder what mother would tell me if she were here. What advice she'd give about all this." Sarah considered carefully. "I think I'd ask her if she was afraid. When she realized what you were, what you'd become. If she worried about the isolation you'd face, or if she believed you'd find people who understood." Cassian's eyes went distant. "She sang to me in Old Valtherian. Even when I was too young to understand the words. The physician said it was pointless, that I needed to hear modern languages to develop properly, but she ignored them. She said the old magic recognized its own, and if I was meant to speak the ancient tongue, she'd make sure I knew it was beautiful." "She gave you a gift," Sarah said, "not just the language, but the knowledge that you were loved exactly as you were." The prince nodded slowly. "I wish she could see me now. See that I'm not wasting her gift." "She can," Sarah replied. "Maybe not physically, but the impact she had, the foundation she built. It's present in everything you do. Every word you speak in Old Valtherian honors her memory. That week, Cassian made a request that surprised everyone. He wanted to give a public lecture in Old Valtherian, open to any citizen who wished to attend, not just nobles. He wanted to teach, to share knowledge, to prove that the language his mother loved could be accessible to everyone, not just the elite. The king hesitated, concerned about security, about overwhelming the young prince, but Cassian was insistent, and eventually they reached a compromise. The lecture would be held in the palace gardens, open air with guards posted throughout. Attendance would be first come, first served. Sarah would translate for those who didn't understand Old Valtherian. Advertisements were posted throughout the city, and the response was overwhelming. On the day of the lecture, hundreds of people gathered in the gardens, from all districts, all classes. Nobles in silk stood beside laborers in homespun. Scholars mingled with illiterate farmers curious about the prince they'd never seen. Marcus and a dozen other guards maintained a perimeter, their attention sharp for any threat. Cassian stood on a raised platform, looking out at the sea of faces, and for a moment Sarah worried he'd freeze, overwhelmed by the sheer number of people. But then he began to speak, his voice clear and strong, and the crowd fell silent. He spoke about the history of Old Valtherian, about its role in building the vampire kingdom, about the beauty of a language that carried magic in every syllable. He taught them simple phrases. Hello. Thank you. Welcome. Peace. He explained the grammatical structures that made Old Valtherian unique, the way verb conjugations carried emotional context, the way nouns had historical resonance. And as he spoke, Sarah translated, her voice weaving between his words, creating a bridge between ancient and modern. Between the prince and his people, something extraordinary happened as the lecture continued. People began attempting the phrases Cassian taught them, their pronunciation clumsy but earnest. Children giggled as they tried to wrap their mouths around unfamiliar sounds. Adults concentrated with furrowed brows, determined to get it right. And slowly, gradually, the language that had been locked away, forbidden, almost lost, began to spread through the crowd like spring flowers after winter. An old woman from the lower districts raised her hand. Prince Cassian, why does this matter? Why should we learn an old language? Most of us can barely read the common tongue. What use is something this complicated? Cassian's answer was thoughtful, delivered in Old Valtherian that Sarah immediately translated. Because language shapes how we think. Old Valtherian has concepts that don't exist in modern speech. Ways of describing time, magic, connection that we've lost. When we lose language, we lose ways of understanding the world, and I believe everyone deserves access to all the ways of thinking, all the tools for understanding, not just the ones that people in power decide are acceptable. The woman nodded slowly, and Sarah saw understanding dawn on her weathered face. You're saying knowledge shouldn't be rationed. It should be shared. Exactly, Cassian replied, his smile bright. My mother believed that. My tutor believes that, and I believe it too. The lecture continued for 2 hours, and by the end people were asking when the next one would be, begging for more instruction, volunteering to help establish learning centers where Old Valtherian could be taught widely. Cassian promised to return monthly, to continue teaching anyone who wanted to learn. As the crowd dispersed, Lord Ashford approached the platform, his expression thoughtful. Prince Cassian, that was remarkable. You have your mother's gift for connecting with people. She would be extraordinarily proud of you. Cassian's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Lord Ashford. That means everything to me. The elderly vampire bowed deeply, then turned to Sarah. And you, Miss Blackwood, you are doing work that matters, preserving what should never have been nearly lost. Don't let them discourage you. Don't let them make you doubt. That evening, Sarah found a letter slipped under her door. No signature, but the handwriting was educated, the paper expensive. You've won this battle, it read. The prince charmed the commoners, and the king supports you. But popularity is fickle. Power is not. Remember that accidents happen. Remember that you are alone here, with no family to avenge you, no connections to investigate your disappearance. Enjoy your victory. It may be your last. Sarah's hands shook as she read the threat. She should show it to the king, to Marcus, to someone who could help. But what would they do? Post more guards? Lock her in her chamber? She couldn't live in fear, couldn't stop teaching because someone wanted her silent. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her desk. Evidence, if anything happened. Proof that the threats had been ongoing. But she wouldn't let fear stop her. She'd made an oath. She'd promised to teach Cassian, to help him understand his gift, and she'd keep that promise. Threats be damned. The next month brought changes neither Sarah nor her enemies could have anticipated. King Theron, inspired by his son's public lectures, issued a royal decree establishing the Academy of Old Languages. It would be funded by the Crown, open to students from all districts, dedicated to preserving and teaching not just Old Valtherian, but other dying languages throughout the realm. Cassian would serve as the youngest instructor, teaching children's classes. Sira would direct the curriculum, training other teachers. It was ambitious, radical, and deeply threatening to those who'd built their power on controlling access to knowledge. The council erupted in protest. Lord Armitage argued the expense was unjustifiable, that the kingdom had more pressing needs than linguistic preservation. Lady Viridian claimed the academy would be dangerous, gathering people with knowledge of magical languages in one place. Other nobles complained that opening education to the lower districts would upset social balance, create unrest, foster dangerous ideas about equality. The king listened to their objections, with patience that Sarah recognized as barely leashed frustration. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. This academy will be built. Objections are noted, but overruled. My son has demonstrated the value of these languages. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive, and I have decided that a kingdom's strength is measured not by how much knowledge it hoards, but by how widely that knowledge is shared. Any council member who cannot support this vision may wish to reconsider their position. It was a declaration that sent shockwaves through the palace hierarchy. Some council members resigned immediately, unwilling to serve a king who would elevate commoners through education. Others stayed, but retreated into resentful silence. A few, like Lord Ashford, embraced the change wholeheartedly, volunteering to help fund and support the academy. The site chosen for the academy was an old fortress on the palace grounds abandoned for centuries, its halls empty and echoing. Renovation began immediately, paid for by royal treasury and private donations from those nobles who supported the king's vision. Sarah spent long days overseeing the work, planning curriculum, interviewing potential teachers. It was exhausting, exhilarating, terrifying. She was 23 years old, directing an institution that could reshape vampire society, and every decision felt weighted with consequence. Cassian visited the construction site frequently, his excitement palpable. He sketched plans for classroom layouts, suggested which texts should be prioritized in the library, debated philosophy with the architects about how physical space influenced learning. Watching him, Sarah saw glimpses of the king he'd become. Thoughtful, passionate, committed to justice. His mother would have been proud. One afternoon, as they toured the nearly completed building, Cassian turned to Sarah with unusual seriousness. "Miss Sarah, what happens when I don't need a tutor anymore?" Sarah's heart clenched. She'd known this question would come eventually, had dreaded it despite understanding its necessity. "When you don't need me as a tutor, you'll hopefully still want me as a friend. And I'll continue teaching at the academy, training other instructors, preserving the knowledge my grandmother died protecting. But you won't leave?" Cassian's hands moved anxiously. "You won't decide I'm educated enough and go somewhere else?" Sarah knelt to his level, taking his hands in hers. "I made an oath in Old Valtherian, remember? I bound my life to your service. That binding doesn't end when lessons do. It ends when you release me, or when death comes. And I'm not planning on either happening anytime soon." The prince hugged her tightly, his small body trembling slightly. I don't want to need you forever, but I also don't want to not need you. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Sarah assured him. That's how all healthy relationships work. We grow more capable, more independent, but we still choose connection. You'll outgrow needing a tutor. But hopefully, you'll never outgrow needing people who understand you. The Academy's opening ceremony was scheduled for the first day of spring. Invitations went out to everyone, nobles and commoners alike, anyone interested in attending the inaugural lecture. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people confirmed attendance. Far more than the Academy grounds could hold. Security became a pressing concern. Marcus coordinated with the Royal Guard, planning crowd control measures, identifying potential threats. You realize, he told Sarah during one of their planning meetings, that you've become a target. Not just you specifically, but what you represent. There are factions who see this academy as the beginning of social upheaval. They may attempt to disrupt the opening ceremony, to make a statement. We're prepared, Sarah replied, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. We have guards. We have contingency plans. We've been careful. Careful isn't always enough, Marcus said grimly. Promise me you'll stay alert. Don't eat or drink anything that hasn't been verified. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust anyone outside your immediate circle. The level of paranoia required was exhausting, but Sarah agreed, understanding that Marcus's concern came from genuine care, from understanding that her death would devastate Cassian and potentially derail everything they'd built. The night before the ceremony, Sarah couldn't sleep. She wandered the academy halls, running her fingers along freshly painted walls, breathing in the smell of new books in the library, standing in empty classrooms that would soon be filled with students hungry for knowledge. She'd done this. With the king's support and Cassian's inspiration, yes, but she'd turned a vision into reality. Her grandmother would have wept with joy. She found herself in the main lecture hall, standing where she'd deliver tomorrow's inaugural address. The room was massive, able to seat 300 people, with additional spaces for those willing to stand. Tomorrow, it would be full. Tomorrow she'd stand before hundreds of people and speak about why language mattered, why knowledge should be shared, why the old ways were worth preserving. No pressure. You can't sleep either? Sarah turned to find King Theron standing in the doorway, dressed simply in dark clothes, no crown, no armor, just a father and king dealing with the weight of leadership. She curtsied automatically. Your Majesty, I didn't expect anyone else to be here. I wanted to see it one last time before tomorrow's chaos, the king said, entering the hall. This place represents everything Alara dreamed of, education accessible to all, knowledge flowing freely, magic and history and language shared rather than hoarded. If she could see this, she'd be overwhelmed with joy. You must miss her terribly, Sarah said softly. Every day, Theron replied, but I see her in Cassian. In his passion for learning, his determination to share what he knows, his absolute refusal to accept that some people deserve education while others don't. She lives in him. And in you, too. In your commitment to preserving what others tried to destroy. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I'm just trying to honor my grandmother. To finish the work she started, the king moved to stand beside her, both of them looking out at the empty seats that would soon be filled. That's all any of us can do. Honor those who came before. Build on the foundations they laid. Try to leave the world slightly better than we found it. They stood in comfortable silence for a long moment. Then the king spoke again, his tone shifting to something more serious. Miss Blackwood, there are credible threats against tomorrow's ceremony. We've intercepted correspondence suggesting that Lord Armitage's faction plans to disrupt the opening. We don't know specifics, but Marcus and the guard are on high alert. I wanted you to know so you could be prepared. Sarah's stomach tightened. What kind of disruption? The king shook his head. We're not certain. It could be something as minor as public protest. It could be something more dangerous. We've taken every precaution we can. But if you want to postpone, if you feel unsafe, I would understand. No, Sarah said firmly. We postpone, we give them power. We show them that threats work. The academy opens tomorrow as planned. I'll be careful. But I won't be cowed. The king smiled slightly. Elara would have said the same thing. Stubborn to the point of recklessness, it drove me insane with worry. But it was also one of the things I loved most about her. That unshakable conviction that doing the right thing mattered more than staying safe. Be careful tomorrow, Miss Blackwood. Cassian needs you. And if I'm being honest, so do I. The morning of the academy's opening dawned clear and cold spring sunshine streaming through windows that sparkled from fresh cleaning. Sarah dressed in her finest clothes, which still looked modest compared to noble finery, but were the best she'd ever owned, courtesy of the king's insistence that the academy director should look the part. Her hands trembled as she fastened the buttons, adrenaline and anxiety mixing in her veins. Marcus arrived early, his expression grim. We've secured the perimeter. Guards are stationed throughout the grounds. We've checked every food item that will be served. But Miss Blackwood, I need you to understand that if anything goes wrong, if you perceive any threat at all, you run. You don't try to be heroic. You don't try to protect others. You run, and you let the trained guards handle it. Sarah nodded, though she wondered if she'd actually be able to follow that instruction. How could she run if Cassian was in danger? But she understood Marcus's concern, understood that her death would accomplish nothing except giving their enemies a victory. The crowd began gathering hours before the ceremony. By the time Sarah arrived at the main hall, the academy grounds were packed with people. Nobles in elegant dress mingled with commoners in simple clothes. Scholars carried notebooks, eager to document the historic occasion. Children ran between adults' legs, excited by the festival atmosphere. Cassian waited for her near the entrance, dressed in formal robes that made him look older than his 8 years. He was trying to appear calm, but Sarah could see the nervous energy in every small movement. You're going to be wonderful, she signed. You know this material better than anyone. I know the material. He signed back. I'm worried about the people. What if they don't listen? What if Lord Armitage causes problems? Then we handle it, Sarah replied. Together. You're not alone in this. The king appeared, flanked by guards, and the crowd parted respectfully. He looked every inch the monarch today, armor polished to mirror brightness, crown firmly in place, the weight of kingship visible in his bearing. But when he looked at his son, all the royal formality melted away, replaced by simple fatherly pride. Ready? He asked in Old Valtherian, his pronunciation much improved, but still carrying a slight accent. As ready as I can be, Cassian replied. Father, thank you for supporting this, for believing in me, for learning my language. The king knelt, bringing himself to his son's level in full view of the assembled crowd. I should have done it years ago, but we're here now, and I am so proud of the man you're becoming. They embraced briefly, then the king stood, resuming his royal bearing. Let's begin. The ceremony opened with the king's formal address. He spoke about the importance of preserving knowledge, about the role of education in building a stronger kingdom, about his vision for a realm where every citizen had access to learning regardless of birth or wealth. His words were carefully crafted, politically astute, designed to inspire while also defending the academy's existence against inevitable criticism. Then it was Cassian's turn. The young prince approached the podium, a small figure before a sea of faces, and began to speak in Old Valtherian. His voice was clear, confident, carrying across the crowded hall. He spoke about language as magic, about words as bridges between past and present, about the responsibility of those who knew the old ways to share that knowledge. Sarah translated simultaneously, her voice weaving between his words, and the crowd listened with rapt attention. Even those who'd come skeptical found themselves drawn in by the prince's obvious passion, his genuine love for the subject, his ability to make ancient concepts feel relevant to modern life. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly. Sarah's instincts, honed by weeks of threats and danger, began screaming warnings. She scanned the crowd, looking for anything out of place, any sign of the disruption Marcus had feared. There, near the back of the hall, Lord Armitage and several other council members, standing in a tight cluster, watching with expressions of cold calculation rather than interest. One of them nodded slightly, and 3 figures in servants' clothing began, moving through the crowd, too purposefully, too coordinated. Sarah's pulse spiked. She caught Marcus's eye, gestured subtly toward the moving figures. He saw them immediately, signaled to other guards. But before anyone could intercept, the 3 figures produced vials from their clothing and threw them directly at the podium where Cassian stood. Time seemed to slow. Sarah's body moved before her mind caught up, diving toward the prince, arms outstretched. The vials shattered, releasing thick red smoke that billowed outward, acrid and choking. The crowd screamed, people shoving toward exits in panic. Sarah reached Cassian, wrapping herself around him, feeling the smoke burn her throat and lungs. She tried to drag him away from the podium, away from the worst of it, but the smoke was everywhere, disorienting, making it impossible to tell which direction led to safety. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders, Marcus's voice in her ear. "I've got you both. Hold on." He lifted them bodily, carrying them through the chaos toward a side exit. Behind them, she heard the king's voice shouting orders, guards attempting to control the panicking crowd. The smoke followed them even outside, drifting on the wind, and Sarah's vision began to blur. The burning in her lungs intensified, her limbs going weak. Marcus set them down once they were clear, and another guard immediately checked Cassian. The prince was coughing, his eyes streaming, but he seemed relatively unharmed. Sarah tried to speak, to ask if he was okay, but her throat closed up, her body suddenly refusing to cooperate. She collapsed, the world spinning. She was dimly aware of shouting, of hands supporting her, of someone calling for a physician. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Cassian's terrified face, his mouth forming her name in silent plea. She woke in the palace infirmary, her throat raw, her head pounding. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, suggesting it was either the same day much later, or possibly the next day entirely. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as dizziness swamped her. "Easy," a gentle voice said. A female physician appeared beside her bed, pressing a cool hand to her forehead. "You inhaled a significant amount of toxic smoke. You're lucky that guard got you out when he did. Another few minutes and we'd be having a very different conversation." "Cassian," Sarah croaked, her voice barely functional. "Is he safe?" "He's fine," the physician assured her. "He didn't inhale nearly as much as you did. He's been here 3 times demanding to see you, but we've been keeping him away until you woke up. The king's orders. He didn't want the prince more traumatized than necessary." "What happened? After? Who were those people?" The physician's expression darkened. The 3 attackers were apprehended immediately. They confessed under questioning to being hired by certain council members who opposed the academy's opening. The smoke was meant to be a terror tactic, not lethal, but the combination of ingredients was more dangerous than anticipated. Several people were injured. You took the worst of it because you threw yourself directly into the cloud to protect the prince. Sarah's memory of that moment was hazy, instinct-driven rather than conscious decision. Is Lord Armitage in custody?" The physician nodded. "Him and 4 other council members. They're being held pending formal charges. The king is, well, furious doesn't begin to cover it. You'll want to rest for several more days, but you should make a full recovery. Your voice may be scratchy for a while, and your lungs will be sensitive, but nothing permanent. You were very brave, Miss Blackwood. Also very reckless. But mostly brave." The door burst open, and Cassian rushed in, followed by the king and Marcus, all of them ignoring the physician's protests about rest and quiet. The prince launched himself at Sarah's bed, tears streaming down his face. "You almost died," he signed frantically. You could have died, and it would have been my fault. My event. My speech. Never. Sarah signed back, her hands clumsy but determined. Nothing is your fault. Those men chose violence. You chose knowledge. Their choices don't define you. The king placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Miss Blackwood is right. This attack was not caused by the Academy or your speech. It was caused by people who fear change, who fear losing power, who fear a world where knowledge is freely shared. And they have failed. The Academy will not close. Your work will continue. The ceremony was interrupted, but it was not stopped. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. What happens now? Now, the king said, his expression grim. Those responsible face justice. Lord Armitage and his co-conspirators will be tried for attempted murder, for treason, for conspiracy to undermine the crown. The evidence is overwhelming. They will be stripped of titles. Exiled if I'm feeling merciful. Executed if the law demands it. And the Academy? Sarah asked. Opens properly, with appropriate security measures. In 2 weeks, the king replied. We've already begun enrolling students. The attack, if anything, has increased public support. People are furious that someone would try to prevent education through violence. You've become something of a folk hero, Miss Blackwood. The woman who threw herself into toxic smoke to save the prince. The commoner who stood against corrupt nobles. Ballads are already being written. Sarah groaned. That's the last thing I need. Cassian finally spoke aloud, his voice hoarse but determined. They tried to silence us. They failed. We'll be louder. We'll teach more people. We'll make sure old Valtherian survives and thrives. They can threaten us, but they can't stop what we've started. The king's smile was proud and fierce. That's my son. That's my heir. 2 months later, the Academy of Old Languages celebrated its first graduating class. 20 students from diverse backgrounds completed the intensive introductory course in Old Valtherian, demonstrating mastery of basic conversation, simple spell work, and historical comprehension. Sarah stood at the ceremony, her voice fully recovered, her lungs healed, watching with pride as each graduate received their certificate. Cassian presented the awards personally, speaking to each student in Old Valtherian, his words carrying genuine warmth and encouragement. The prince had grown in those 2 months, not just in knowledge, but in confidence. He taught 3 classes weekly now, working with children primarily, but occasionally adults who wanted to learn from the vampire, Prince himself. His patience was remarkable, his teaching style intuitive, adapting to each student's needs. He had his mother's gift for connecting with people, for making complex concepts accessible, for inspiring others to pursue knowledge. The king attended most of Cassian's classes, still learning, still practicing, determined to achieve fluency. His Old Valtherian remained accented but functional, and the sight of monarch and prince conversing in the ancient tongue had become familiar throughout the palace. Their relationship had transformed entirely. Where once there had been painful distance, now there was genuine closeness, easy affection. The kind of bond that came from choosing connection despite difficulty. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing lesson plans in her office, a knock at the door preceded Lord Ashford's entrance. The elderly vampire looked tired, but satisfied. Miss Blackwood. I wanted to inform you personally. The council has voted to formally recognize Old Valtherian as an official language of the realm. Legal documents can be written in it. Oaths can be sworn in it. It's no longer relegated to historical curiosity status. This is because of you. Because of what you and Prince Cassian have built. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for telling me. And thank you for your support throughout all of this. We couldn't have succeeded without allies like you. Ashford smiled. My grandmother would have loved to see this day. She spoke Old Valtherian until the day she died, despite the social pressure to abandon it. She'd be proud to know it's being preserved, celebrated, taught to new generations. He paused, his expression growing serious. Lord Armitage was executed this morning. The others were exiled, their families stripped of titles and holdings. It was necessary, but I won't pretend it brings me joy. Even traitors were once people who believed they were protecting something important. They just chose the wrong methods. Justice is rarely clean, Sarah agreed. But it's necessary. The Academy couldn't function if those who attacked it faced no consequences. After Ashford left, Sarah sat in silence, processing the news. Armitage was dead. The man who'd threatened her, who'd ordered the attack that nearly killed her, and Cassian, who'd represented everything wrong with hoarding knowledge and power, was gone. She should feel triumphant, vindicated. Instead, she just felt tired and grateful to be alive. That evening, she found herself in the palace gardens, walking among spring flowers, breathing in air that felt sweeter after having temporarily lost the ability to breathe at all. The gardens had become her favorite retreat, a place where she could think without interruption, where the weight of responsibility lifted slightly. Miss Sarah? She turned to find Cassian approaching, Marcus trailing behind at a respectful distance. The prince's guard had become a permanent fixture, a reminder that some threats never fully disappeared. Shouldn't you be at dinner? Sarah signed. I wanted to talk to you, Cassian replied. About something important. They sat on a stone bench overlooking a fountain, and Cassian took a breath before signing again. Father wants to formally adopt you. Not as his child, but as part of the royal family. As my official mentor and protector. It comes with a title. Land holdings. A seat on the Education Council. He said, you deserve recognition for what you've done, and he wants to make sure you're protected if anything ever happens to him. Sarah's breath caught. That's extraordinary. And terrifying. I'm not noble. I don't know how to be noble. You don't have to be noble, Cassian insisted. You just have to be you. Someone who cares about knowledge, who protects people who need protecting, who stands up for what's right even when it's dangerous. That's what nobility should mean. Not birth or wealth, but character. What do you want? Sarah asked. This is your family. How do you feel about me becoming formally part of it? The prince's answer was immediate. I want you to stay forever. I want to know that you're safe, that you're protected, that when I'm king someday you'll be there to remind me why knowledge matters. You saved my life. You gave me back my father. You helped me understand that being different wasn't a curse. How could I not want you to be family? Sarah hugged him tightly. Then, I accept. Whatever title comes with it, whatever responsibilities, I accept. Because you're right. We are family already. We might as well make it official. A month later, in a ceremony that combined ancient ritual and modern custom, Sarah Blackwood became Lady Sarah Morvith, royal educator and protector, formally recognized as a member of the royal household with all accompanying rights and responsibilities. She stood before the court in ceremonial robes, speaking the oath of adoption in perfect Old Valtherian while the king and prince witnessed. It felt surreal, impossible, like a dream she might wake from at any moment. But it was real. The girl from the lower districts who'd taught herself to read from stolen glances at merchant ledgers now stood among the highest-ranking members of the kingdom. And she'd earned it, not through birth or connections, but through knowledge, courage, and stubborn refusal to accept that education should be restricted to the privileged few. The academy continued to grow. By year's end, enrollment had tripled. New languages were added to the curriculum. Elvish and Dwarvish and ancient human dialects that scholars had thought lost. The model proved so successful that other kingdoms began establishing their own academies, sending representatives to study Sarah's methods, asking for guidance. Knowledge, once hoarded, began flowing freely across borders, across classes, across every artificial barrier that had been constructed to keep it contained. 5 years after that first disastrous interview where she'd been mocked by council members, Sarah stood in the expanded academy's grand lecture hall, watching Prince Cassian, now 13, deliver an address to an audience that included ambassadors from 6 different kingdoms. He spoke in flawless Old Valthyrian about the responsibility of knowledge, about the power that came from understanding the past, about the future they could build if they chose wisdom over ignorance. His mother would have been overwhelmingly proud. His grandmother, Sarah's grandmother, all the scholars and teachers and knowledge keepers who'd come before, would have wept with joy. After the lecture, as the crowd dispersed and dignitaries offered congratulations, King Theron pulled Sarah aside. "You did this," he said quietly. "You took an angry, isolated boy and helped him become this. You took a dying language and made it live again. You changed the kingdom fundamentally, permanently for the better." Sarah shook her head. "We did this. All of us together. You chose to learn rather than force Cassian to change. He chose to share rather than hoard his knowledge. The students chose courage over comfort. I was just one piece. An important piece, the king insisted, and one I'm grateful for every day." He returned to the crowd, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. She wandered to the library, running her fingers along spines of newly acquired texts, marveling at how far they'd come. In a quiet corner, she found the restored journal, her grandmother's handwriting faded but legible, preserved by magic and care. She opened to the final entry, the words she'd read 100 times but never tired of. "If I am the last scholar, then I will teach my granddaughter, and she will teach the next generation, and the words will survive despite their fear." "I did it, grandmother," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "I taught the next generation. The words survived. And they're thriving." She closed the journal gently and looked out the window at the academy grounds, at students of all ages and backgrounds gathered in small groups, studying together, learning together, proving every single day that knowledge was not meant to be locked away but shared freely, generously, with anyone who sought it. The poor girl who'd been laughed at for speaking an ancient language had changed the world, and she was just getting started.